Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Nathan Lawrence here, Hoshana Rabbah. So, every time I come before this camera, I kind of like go into my closet and I say, okay, y'all, how do you want me to dress today? And I look at the different clothes that I have. I don't have a lot of clothes, not like my wife. She's got a lot, but I have a few. And so I'm wearing something I haven't worn in a lot of years. I haven't worn this for a long time. I wanted to dress like an early church father. I don't have a big wooden cross. I don't have any crosses. I don't think I have any crosses anywhere. I'm not against the cross. I just don't have any. If I wanted to, I should have had a big wooden cross and dangle it around my neck. Instead, I've got this is like a breastplate. This represents the breastplate of the 12 tribes of Israel that the high priest wore. This was the closest thing I had to religious regalia that I could wear around my neck. But I put on some robes and a hat. You know, as you can kind of see, I'm dressed a little bit kind of like in the first century style. Because sometimes I think, and don't mind my squeaky chair, it likes to preach while I'm preaching also. It's the way it is. I like this chair, it's comfortable, but it's sure squeaky and there's nothing I can do about it. Anyway, so it is what it is. It just adds to the ambience. So last week, I made a video entitled, Can You Trust the Early Church Fathers? Well, this is going to be kind of a continuation of that teaching, but go a little bit deeper. And because actually today is the last day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, 2024, and the subject of the Feast of Unleavened Bread is leavening, or de-leavening, or removing sin out of your life. That's the main object lesson of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But Yeshua, well, we know from the Bible that leaven is a metaphor, a biblical metaphor for sin, because the chemical agent within leavening that makes bread dough rise is leavening, or yeast. There's other leavening agents too, but yeast is the main one. And hang on, let me get my notes up here a little bit bigger. There we go. There we go. And yeast is a descriptive symbol for sin in one's life, because like as yeast permeates the dough, yeast is a fungus, and it actually creates a souring effect. You've all heard of sourdough, and it literally infests the bread, and it ferments, and it causes the bread to rise. And this is yeast is an apt metaphor for sin in one's life, because you get a little bit of sin and it grows. It's like the apple in the apple box. You've all had apples or other fruit, and when one starts to rot, then it touches the next one, and then eventually the whole box of apples rots. That could go for any vegetable or any fruit. And leavening, or yeast, or in this case, a fungus, spreads. And that's how sin is. 1 Corinthians 5, 6 through 8, Paul says, your glorying is not good. He was talking to the Corinthian church there because there was sin in the camp. Know ye not that a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump? Purge out therefore the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you are unleavened. For even Messiah our Passover is sacrificed for us. Therefore let us keep the feast of unleavened bread, not with old leaven, neither with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So when we eat unleavened bread during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and we get rid of the leavening, this is a picture of getting sin out of our lives and dealing with the corrupting influences of sin in our lives. But there is another type of spiritual leaven that is equally dangerous and that Yeshua warned his disciples about. And that is the leaven of false doctrine. In Matthew 16, verse 6, Yeshua said unto his disciples, "Take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the Sadducees." And then a little bit later in the same chapter, Yeshua said, "How is it that you do not understand that I spoke it not to you concerning bread, that you should beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees? Then understand they how that he bade them not beware of the leaven of bread, but of the doctrine of the Pharisees and the Sadducees." So their doctrine, not Jehovah's truth, not the word of Elohim, not the Torah, but their doctrine. Whatever that was, it was their doctrine that he was not happy with. And then Mark 8:15, and he charged them, that is Yeshua charged or commanded his disciples, "Take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." So King Herod was a Jew and an Edomite. He was a mixed race. And basically he was saying, beware of the culture and the political system around you, the religious and the cultural political system around you. The sin and the leaven, do not let that corrupt you and be a corrupting influence. And then Luke 12, verse 10, in the meantime, when there were gathered together an innumerable multitude of people, insomuch as they trode one upon another, he began to say unto his disciples, first of all, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. So hypocrisy is where you tell somebody to do one thing, but you do something else yourself. You do not practice what you preach. So the leaven was the false doctrine that had crept into the Jewish religious system that was contrary to the word of Elohim. These were in part the traditions of men that made the word of Elohim of none effect. In Mark 7, starting in verse 5, we read, "Then the Pharisees and scribes asked him, why walk not thy disciples according to the traditions of the elders?" Not the Bible, not the Torah, but the traditions of the elder, the extra biblical stuff. "But eat bread with unwashed hands." They had an elaborate, Pharisees had an elaborate non-biblical, extra-biblical washing ritual, involved pouring water from in a cup on your hand from one to the other and back and forth, and prayers and all kinds of things. I mean, it took like 10 minutes to go through this before you could even eat your food. I know, I've watched Jews do that before. It's in their prayer books. He answered and said unto them, well hath Isaiah prophesied of you hypocrites. There's the leaven. You hypocrites. As it is written, this people honoreth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. For laying aside the commandments of Elohim, ye hold the tradition of men as the washing of pots and cups and many other things like things that you do. And he said unto them, full well you reject the commandments of Elohim, that you may keep your own tradition, making the word of Elohim of none effect through your tradition, which you have delivered, and many such things you do. So he was saying your religious doctrines, your traditions, your extra biblical stuff, you in effect have rendered null and void the written word of Elohim. But do we really think that the Pharisees of Yeshua's day were the only religious leaders in the history of the church or in the history of the saints of Elohim to be guilty of this sin of promoting spiritual leaven, of nullifying the word of Elohim by their man-made, non-biblical, even pagan traditions? Hardly. Humans are humans, then and now, regardless of the epoch, the culture, or the country. There is nothing new under the sun, as Solomon declared. This brings us to the so-called early church fathers of the 2nd century of the Common Era, who laid much of the theological foundation by interpreting or reinterpreting the biblical truth for the Christian church of the 2nd century, which eventually became the Roman Catholic Church, from which nearly all other Christian denominations and churches trace their lineage. The rails of biblical truth. The Bible has given us a certain spiritual guidelines, like rails on a train track, to keep us pointed in the right direction and on the track toward redemption or salvation, sanctification, and eventually the eternal reward of glorification, being born into the family as glorified sons and daughters of Yehovah Elohim. These rails help to keep our faith strong during our spiritual journey and our focus straight ahead. Indeed, Christianity tends to promote keeping one's eyes on Jesus. But in practical terms, what does that actually mean? Do we keep our eyes only on a personality? Or is Christianity more than a personality cult? You know, too often Christianity has tended to be a religion about Jesus, but not the religion of Yeshua, what he actually did, how he lived his life. Shouldn't we be trying to obey what he taught, emulate how he lived, which means, doing what he did? It is one thing to keep our focus on Yeshua, a good thing, to be sure. But it's another, and at a higher level, it's another thing to obey what he actually taught. His commandments, which tell us how to love him and love our fellow man, and how to live a life of holiness, being set apart from this world, or being in the world, but not of the world. So at the center of the religion of Yeshua was the concept of holiness, which is about separation. Separation from what? From pollution, or that which is impure, or that which defiles. And it's about becoming holy as Yehovah is holy. What pollution? The pollution of the world, the flesh, and the devil, of course. There are several key elements or rails of the track to follow that Yehovah has given us to follow to become separate from the world. What are they? They have to do with holy food and holy times. The foods Yehovah's people eat and the special times that Yehovah is called holy or set apart when he commands his saints to come out of the world and to focus on him has a lot to do with biblical holiness. It is about transcendency, that is transcending or rising above the mundane or the profane or the carnal. Getting out above the world, getting outside of ourselves, outside of the world, the flesh, and the devil, and coming to a higher level, where we will commune with Yehovah on his feast days, on his Sabbaths, and with food, and celebrating over food that we eat, and communing with him and with one another. If you cannot eat the world's food or observe their holidays and celebrations, that largely puts you on the outs with those around you. And you all know what I'm talking about. The Christian church, they're all busy working or playing on Shabbat while we are resting. And they are going to church on Sunday while we are playing and working. Not only that, they have their Christo-pagan holidays. Christmas, Easter, Lent, Halloween, All Saints Day. I don't know what all of them. Good Friday, Palm Sunday. Most of these things come out of pagan traditions and mixed with Christianity. And while they're doing that, we're doing the biblical feasts, and we don't feel comfortable hanging out with them on those days. And they don't feel comfortable hanging out with us. So these are separating elements, and we don't feel comfortable hanging out with the world either. So these are natural eliminating factors that separate us from the world. And for good reason. Yah wants us to, we're not better than the world, but he wants us to be separate from the world. And these are holiness issues. After all, what does the word church mean? When you read the word church in your Bibles, it's the Greek word ekklesia. Ekklesia. It literally means the called out ones. Called out of what? The world. Be separate. Come out of her, my people. Come out of Babylon. Sadly, the early church fathers of the 2nd century and onward, in a markedly and determinate manner, veered off the rails of the Hebraic faith of Yeshua and his apostles and commenced to move in an unbiblical direction, which they passed on down to the Christian church to this day. If we care about biblical truth, we must face the fact that our fathers have inherited many lies. I'm not going to say that everything the Christian church teaches is bad. It's not. There's a lot of good things. I'm only talking about the things that they teach that are totally antithetical to and opposed to the Word and the Spirit and the truth of Elohim as revealed in the Bible. We'll talk about a few of those things momentarily. If we care about biblical truth, we must face the fact that our fathers have inherited lies which have been passed down to us. Jeremiah 16, verse 19. They have rejected the truth of Yehovah's Torah and considered it a strange thing. Hosea 4:6 and Hosea 8:12. This was all prophesied. This happened with the ancient Israelites, and it happened with the early church fathers. These cycles repeat themselves. Truth, revelation of truth, apostasy. Revival, revelation of truth, apostasy, revival. Let's add another one. Revelation of truth, apostasy, judgment, and then revival. Revelation of truth, divine truth, apostasy, judgment, divine judgment, and then revival. And this is an endless cycle that's been going on with Yah's people for thousands of years. The Bible records this cycle happening again and again and again. And it happened, the cycle repeated itself. When Yeshua came, there was revival. There was revival. And there was revelation of truth, and then there was revival. And then there was judgment against the Jewish nation. Their temple was destroyed. Their system was destroyed. And then eventually, and the Jews went apostate, and eventually, after the death of the last apostles, the Christians went apostate to a certain degree, as recorded in the writings of the early church fathers. Not only was the Torah considered a strange thing, but they even rebelled against it. Hosea 8:1. The call is now going out to come back to the good and ancient paths of Torah, Jeremiah 6:19, to return to the law of Moses and to the fathers of our faith before the great and terrible day of Yehovah's wrath. Malachi 4, verses 4 through 6, and Hosea 6, verse 1. through, I don't know, 2 or 3. So the rails of our biblical faith that lead to the kingdom of Elohim include teaching and then living out Yehovah's Torah laws along with his standards of holiness, including the seventh-day Sabbath, the biblical feasts, which are a sign, which I've talked about, Exodus 31:13 and 17, and Ezekiel 20, verse 12 and 20. They are a sign of his people. They are a sign of his saints. And you say, well, that has to do with ancient Israel. Well, my Bible says in Revelation chapter 12 and 14 that the end time saints will be keeping the commandments of God, of Elohim, and have the testimony of Yeshua. What are the commandments of Elohim? Ezekiel chapter 20, among other places, tells us my law, my Torah law, my statutes, my judgments, and don't profane my Sabbaths, my feast days, and all those things. And I'm going to bring you back from where I've scattered you, and I'm going to put you under the bond of the covenant. And those that want to keep my commandments, they will be allowed to go into the kingdom. Those who don't will not. Not my word, the word of Yehovah Elohim. And those prophecies have not been fulfilled yet. I don't care what the liars in the pulpits tell you or those who ignore the truth. They have not been fulfilled yet. Not in the full sense that Ezekiel was talking about. They were fulfilled in a small sense with the return of some of the exiles from Babylon back to Judea after the 70 years captivity, but not in the full sense of the full sense of all the Bible prophecies, where Yah said he scattered his people to the furthest islands, the furthest coastlands of the world, and he's going to regather them. That hasn't happened yet. It's beginning to happen with the Jews returning to the Holy Land, but has not happened for all the 12 tribes of Israel, just Judah. That's a whole other discussion. Curiously, the facts of history bear this out. The seventh-day Sabbath, let me back up. The Bible predicted that Yehovah's people would turn from his Torah, and that's called apostasy. It isn't, like I said, it's an endless cycle that repeats itself again and again and again. And the Sabbath, the biblical feasts, and the dietary laws are some of the first things that go by the wayside when his people go apostate. Curiously, and the facts of history bear this out, that the seventh-day Sabbath, the biblical feasts, and the dietary laws, along with a general opposition to Yehovah's Torah, also known as the Mosaic Law, were among the first aspects of biblical truth that not only Yehovah's people in the past abandoned, but the early church fathers abandoned as well. Apostasy begins here. These are the rails of our faith: the Sabbath, the feasts, the dietary laws, and I would add to that a basic faith in Yeshua and the message of the gospel, which, to the credit of the early church fathers, they kept that one pretty intact, to their credit. And that's one good thing we can say about them. The message of the cross, salvation by grace through faith. But when it comes to obedience issues, they got a little bit lax on that one and very sloppy. And in fact, they pretty well just said the Torah, we need to abolish it. Well, not all of the Torah. They broke it up into pieces: ceremonial, civil, the moral law and all that. And they decided which parts and pieces they wanted to keep. False subdivisions that you cannot make from the scriptures, but that's a whole other discussion. So it was a divide and conquer tactic. So they ripped pages out of the Bible and they said, we don't want the Sabbath and the feast and the dietary laws, but we want the tithe of, we want the moral law, and we don't want the ceremonial law except the tithing law. We'll keep that one. And they took the pick and choose approach and ripped out the pages out of the Bible that they didn't want and kept the things that they needed and that they wanted. And the things that wouldn't really change their lifestyle a whole lot. So apostasy begins with tossing certain things out, and then down the line, as Jehovah's people wake up to the fact that they have left the rails of their faith, it is the Sabbath, the feast, and the biblical dietary laws to which they first return. I like a virtual show of hands. How many of you, when you began to come back to the Hebraic roots of your faith, the Sabbath was one of the first things you came back to? The Sabbath was like, why are we not doing this? Or maybe it was the dietary laws, or maybe it was the feasts. Those are the big three. Most people, those are the doors back. The way out is the way back. To move forward, one must first backtrack to where the errant side rails branched off the main rails into a different direction. So the way out is the way back. The way back is the way forward. Now let us examine some of the written historical records of the sad apostasy of the early church fathers and their abandonment of truth. Now look, I want to be objective. I've read hundreds of pages of the church fathers. I've read a lot and scanned through hundreds, if not a few thousand pages. I've got thousands of pages of the early writings up here in my library, 10 volumes of it. And I've only touched the surface. But it's very easy from their own writings to document the outright lies, false teachings, deceptions, twisting of the scriptures, the calumnies, the virulent racist anti-Semitism, and blasphemies of some of the early church fathers against the truth of the Bible. When you hear the actual quotes, one has to wonder if some of them even ever read the Bible, or if so, how well did they know the scriptures? Yet sadly, many fundamental doctrines of the mainstream or normative Christianity are based on the writings of these men. As the Bible says, our fathers have inherited many lies. It is time to learn the truth, and when you do, you will be set free, as Hosea 4:6 says. And part of that truth, as Hosea 4:6 says, is about coming back to the Torah, because they forgot the Torah. That's the bedrock foundation of the truth. And the Torah points to Yeshua. So when I say Torah, I'm talking about Yeshua, the living Torah, word of Elohim, and the written Torah word. Two aspects of the same thing, indivisible, two sides of the same coin. Yeshua was the Torah word made flesh. You can't separate the two. Sadly, and in many respects, there is manifested among many, if not most of the early church fathers, a lack of understanding of the more distinct and foundational Hebraic concepts of the scriptures, such as the relevance of Jehovah's Torah law to the life of the saints. In many of their writings, they seem to rely more on human reasoning and philosophical explanations than on the written word of Elohim to make their point. It is true that some of the fathers seem to have had a more complete knowledge of the scriptures than others. This may be due to the fact that they had a better access to the actual scarce scrolls and books containing the scriptures than others of their contemporaries. Not everybody had a lot of Bibles around. These Bibles were very rare. The scrolls were rare. They had to be copied by hand and bound, and it was a very expensive process. So maybe they didn't have access to them. If that's the case, they shouldn't have been teachers and be writing about what they didn't know about. Whatever the case, nearly all of them were non-Jewish and thus were not raised in a Hebraic culture as were the writers of the scriptures. Therefore, their understanding is deficient in this area of the Hebraic. Rather, they came from a Hellenistic or a Greek cultural background and were influenced to one degree or another by the Greek philosophers, which permeated and informed the culture and ethos of the Roman Empire. This is evidence in the writings of the early church fathers, where there seems to be a lack of understanding of the Hebraic or Oriental mindset or perspective, and an acquaintance to an acquiescence to that of the Greek perspective with its philosophical backdrop and philosophical approach. That is to say, humanistic or secular humanistic reasoning. With these things in mind, let us now bring to the light of day some of the more anti-Torah and virulent anti-Semitic theologies of the early church fathers, which have been buried deeply in the thousands of pages of their writings. The theological foundations they laid in these writings eventually gave rise to the philosophical and theological Christianity, then to the Christian church system, or what we might call churchianity, as epitomized by Roman Catholicism, and then to the various iterations of mainstream Christianity as we know it today. So a week ago, a week and a half ago or so, I went over some of these things in my previous talk. I'm not going to repeat all of these things in details. So you can go back and watch that video, about, what do we think about the early church fathers, or whatever I titled it. I don't remember right now. But anyway, I go over some of those things. But I will just quote very quickly several things here. Epistle of Barnabas. Let me just say, the epistle of Mathetes to Diognetus, AD 130, refers to the dietary laws, the Sabbath, the biblical feasts, and the new moons as superstitions and utterly ridiculous and unworthy of notice. 130 AD. This is like 35 years after the death of the Apostle John. Barnabas, an Alexandrian Jew who lived between 70 AD and 132 AD, he wrote the Epistle of Barnabas. He says, he misquotes Isaiah 1 verse 14, where he says, "Your new moons, your appointed feasts, my soul hates. They are a trouble to me. I'm weary of bearing them." Well, this is Yehovah speaking. But he says, your new moons, your feasts. He's not talking about his own feasts. He's talking about the perversions, the Christmases and the Easters of their day, which they called holy and their feasts. He said, that's what I hate. But Barnabas twists that to make it look like that Yehovah hated Passover and unleavened bread and Pentecost and trumpets and Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, and Feast of Tabernacles, and the 8th day. The feast that he gave to his people, to commune with his people, the 7 steps in the plan of salvation, the things that would reveal the whole plan of salvation. You mean Yah hated that? The words that came from his mouth, the revelation that he gave to his people, the tabernacle was whole built around the feast days. Yah hated that? Yah hated the second coming of Yeshua, that the feast, the Day of Trumpets and Yom Kippur talk about, point to prophetically. Yah hates the millennium, that the Feast of Tabernacles and the marriage supper of the Lamb, he hates that. He hates the concept of the new heavens and the new earth and the new Jerusalem that the Shemini Atzeret points to. Are you joking me? But this is exactly how ignorant this church father was of the understanding of the Torah and the feasts. This is how ignorant he was. And yet these are the people that the modern preachers and teachers in the Christian church look to as the early church fathers that laid the foundation for the Christian church. Barnabas also talked about keeping the 8th day, that is Sunday, to replace the 7th day. Where is that in the Bible? It's not unless you twist the scriptures and make scriptures say something that it didn't say. Of course, Justin Martyr, who lived from AD 110 to 165, in his dialogue with Trypho, a Jew, argues against the feasts. And he says that the feasts and the Sabbaths were given to the Jews because he's misquoting Ezekiel 20. We already went over that previously. But Yah said that he gave, because of disobedience, the Israelites. Well, I'm not going to go through Ezekiel 20. I made another video on that. But he misquotes that. And he says that, Yah gave the Sabbath and the feast to the Jews and to the Israelites because their hearts were hard and because they were rebellious. No, he punished them because they were rebellious and they turned away from his Sabbaths and profaned his Sabbaths and his feasts, and he gave them over to laws, and he sent them into captivity as a judgment, and he gave them over to the laws of the people who were their captors. That's the context of Exodus 20. And Justin couldn't figure that one out. Shame on him. He didn't know his Bible very well. Justin also promoted the concept, the non-biblical concept of the eighth day replacing, that is Sunday, which is the first day, but he goes into this long, twisted dialogue or dissertation about how the first day is actually the first day is actually the seventh day, and the seventh day is actually the sixth day, and he goes around and around these circular reasoning nonsense, mumbo jumbo, and I went over that in the previous video. I'm not going to go over that again. And then Ignatius, who was a disciple of John, whatever that was worth, he lived from 30 AD to 107 AD, so he was pretty early. He talked about anybody that keeps Passover and fellowships with the Jews, those terrible, awful Jews, he said, is not a partaker, it cannot be, if anyone celebrates the Passover along with the Jews or receives the emblems of their feast, he is a partaker with those that killed the Lord and his apostles. Okay, whatever. And then we have, again, I'm going to skip through. We have Ignatius talking about the Lord's Day, the eighth day, Sunday. That's, again, he's 130 to 107 AD. And we have, it goes on and on. Justin Martyr, but Sunday is the day in which we hold our common assembly, and he promotes a Friday crucifixion, Sunday resurrection theory idea. And Clement of Alexandria, who lived from 150 to 215 AD, promotes the eighth day replacing the seventh day. And he says, for the eighth day may possibly turn out to be properly the seventh day, and the seventh manifestly the sixth. I guess he's the one that gets all confused about that one. Thus, he proves that the seventh day is actually the sixth day, and then goes on in the Greek philosophical style to cite the examples from the nature and numerology and all this other stuff. Ignatius, these guys were into a lot of anti-Torah rhetoric. Ignatius said, if anyone preached the Jewish law, listen not to him. Ignatius, and I'm going to put all of my notes on my blog, so you will have all the footnoted references, okay? So you'll get, I footnote everything, so you can go back and read them for yourself out of their own writings. Ignatius said, all things are passed away, behold, all things have become new. He's quoting Isaiah. For if we still live according to the Jewish law and the circumcision of the flesh, we deny that we have received grace. So there's the heresy of law versus grace. You can't obey the law and be living under grace. How many of you have been accused of from your Christian friends, oh, you're going back to the law, the Mosaic law? You have fallen from grace. How many? I'm seeing the hands rise up. Yeah, that goes back to this false teaching. And Ignatius was not the only one that taught that. This is very early on. And the church is still teaching these lies to this day. Irenaeus, who lived from 120 to, I don't know exactly, 120 to 140 to 200 to 203 AD, he echoes similar things. He makes the assumption that the law of Moses did not precede Moses. He misses the fact that the Torah pre-existed Moses, and that Moses was merely the first human to record it in the term. So in other words, he uses the term law of Moses as if Moses is the one who originated the law of Moses. It wasn't the law of Moses. I mean, that is a biblical term. Moses just took what Yah gave him and wrote it down. He was the first person to write it down. That's why it's called the law of Moses, because Moses wrote it in a Torah scroll. Not that Moses originated it. He did not originate it. He heard it, the voice thundered from Mount Sinai. It wrote, the finger of Elohim wrote it on the tablets of stone, and Moses would go into the tabernacle under the glory cloud and receive instructions and write it down. He calls it the law of bondage. We could go on and on and on. Irenaeus goes on to declare that the Decalogue was not canceled by the new covenant, but the statutes and judgments of Torah were a bondage to the Israelites and are no longer binding on Christians. So he's speaking with forked tongue. He says that part of the law is not for us, part of the law is for us. James, in the book of James, it says, if you violate one, you violate all the commandments. They all stand or fall together. Sin is a violation of the Torah. 1 John 3:4. I mean, there are so many scriptures we could give that totally mitigate and contradict everything these guys are saying. It's unbelievable that anybody would even listen to them. Justin Martyr says that he calls people that follow the law of Moses or the Mosaic law weak-minded. And those who observe the Mosaic law, the Sabbath and feast day observance, are optional and not encouraged. Oh, there's so much here. I mean, I could quote Origen. Origenus would be how his name is pronounced in the Greek. Origen Adamantius, who lived from circa 185 to 235. I'm going to kind of pass over these things. It goes one after the other. Origen against Celsus, book 2. Origen against Celsus, book 2. I got numerous quotes from these guys. And then we have the anti-Semitism of the Epistle of Barnabas. He states that the Israelites lost the covenant when they turned to worshiping the golden calf, which is false. They almost lost the covenant, but Moses interceded for them, and Yah restored them and showed his mercy and grace. That's in the Exodus, 32 and 33. Ignatius says that it is absurd to speak of Jesus Christ with the tongue and to cherish in the mind a Judaism which has now come to an end. For where there is Christianity, there cannot be Judaism. So when he says Judaism, is he referring to the law, the Torah? I suspect he probably does, because that was his viewpoint in other areas of his quotes. And then we have many quotes about the biblical dietary law. Ignatius, but if anyone preach the Jewish law unto you, listen not to him. If anyone confesses the truths mentioned or deems certain kinds of food abominable, such an one has the apostate dragon dwelling in him. I mean, what can I say about this nonsense? This is demonic. He is accusing Yehovah's laws of being demonic. That's blasphemy. And then Origen of Alexandria, he quotes Peter's vision in Acts 10, and he repeats, or I don't know, maybe he originated. I don't know where it originated from, but he teaches that Peter's vision gave the Christians license to eat clean and unclean meats and pork and all this other stuff. Acts chapter 10. It's a license for Christians to eat all manner of meats, which we all know is a false interpretation. That's not what even what the angel who appeared to Peter in Acts chapter 10, how he interpreted the vision. He was referring to Gentiles, not to physical food. He's using an allegory. And yet this same lie, this same argument is the same one that the Christian church teaches down to our age. The interpretation of Acts chapter 10, and you all have heard it many times. This is the blind leading the blind. When the scripture clearly gives the interpretation 3 times in Acts chapter 10 as to what that vision meant. It was referring to Gentiles, not to food. That's Origin against Clesis, book 2, chapter 3. Okay. And then we have the doctrine of the immortality of the soul. I have Epistle of Mathetus to Diognetus. Polycarp was against it. Justin Martyr was for it. Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, and Origen. These all guys, all other than Polycarp, they all advocate the immortality of the soul. Now, the Bible does not advocate, I don't care what the preachers in the pulpit have lied to you, it does not advocate that the soul is immortal. The spirit of man, when it dies, it goes back to heaven and is not conscious, as far as my understanding of the scriptures. But the soul, it dies when the body dies. The Bible says that the soul that sinneth, it shall die. And many other places, the soul of man ceases to exist when the body dies. The thoughts of man, everything, it's in the Psalms, it's in Ezekiel, many places. And they twist Luke 16, the parable of Barnabas, because they do not understand the difference between Agadic and halakhic literature. Again, these Greek, and I'm going over this very quickly. I could stop on every one of these points and talk for a while. But there's a difference between Agadic or the literature, Greek literature or Hebrew literature that tells a story in allegorical or metaphorical terms, which is the parable of Lazarus and the rich man is. They say, well, it's not a parable because it lists somebody's actual name. That's hogwash. That parable cannot be taken literally. It makes no sense if you take everything literal. It does not line up with the rest of the Bible. Yeshua is not making a legal, what we call halakhic statement or about doctrine. In that parable, it's like an Aesop's fable. He's showing that just because you're wealthy and rich does not mean you're going to get a reward in the next life. And just because you're poor and a beggar doesn't mean you're going to lose your reward. That's what the Pharisees taught. That if you're rich, that's God's favor. If you're poor, that's God's disfavor. And he's turning that theory, that philosophy or theology upside down. That's what's really being taught in that parable. And these early church fathers did not understand that. And this lie, this false teaching has been passed on down to our day. And so what the early church fathers, they accepted the concept of the immortality of the soul from the Greek philosophers, because that's what the Greek philosophers taught. The only difference, or let's say the main difference, is they did not teach the transmigration of souls, that when you die, your soul goes into, if you were a good person, it goes into a higher life form. If you were a bad person, it goes into a lower life form, which is what the Hindus teach today, which is why they don't kill their cows, because it might be their uncle or their grandmother or their neighbor or their kid who is reincarnated into another life form. They don't kill cows, flies, or whatever. Why would anybody want to go to India? I have no idea. It's a backward, despicable nation. Filthy. God bless the Christians that live there, have to endure all that. Pray for them. Hinduism has done nothing for those people. So the Greek philosophers taught the transmigration of the soul, and that if you're good enough, the soul would be eventually reabsorbed into the cosmic soul, or the capital U universe, or what they called the pleroma, or nirvana, to quote what the Hindus or the Buddhists or whatever, the world soul. That's what the Greek philosophers taught. The Christians did not teach that. They just taught the immortality of the soul, and that the soul began when Yah gave it and breathed life into a newborn, or a baby in the mother's womb. But then the soul did not die when the body died. The soul went back to God who gave it. And if you were a heathen, it went into eternal torment in hellfire, which again is a non-biblical concept. Lake of fire, yes, but eternal torment, because naturally, if you believe in the immortality of the soul, and the soul is, it's non-destructive, or you can't destroy it, naturally you have to believe in eternal torment. Again, a non-biblical concept. So one false doctrine engendered another false doctrine. So when you go off the rails, one thing leads to another. Okay, I'm not going to spend any more time on the doctrine of the immortality of the soul. We can document that when that came into Christianity and Judaism, but it's not in the Bible. It came into Judaism in the intertestamental period. I've written about that, documented that. You can see it in the Apocrypha, and that's when it eventually made its way into Judaism and eventually into Christianity. So now I want to talk about Marcion of Sinope. Marcion was actually, I'm going to stop right here. I will make another video on Marcion of Sinope. Let me just say that he was an early church heretic. He lived from 85 AD to approximately 160 AD. And he was one of the main heretics that the early church fathers were fighting against and were addressing. I think it's Tertullian, who lived in the 2nd and the 3rd century. He wrote 200 pages just dealing with Marcion, the heresies of Marcion. The main thing that Marcion taught, he was excommunicated from the church by the Bishop of Rome in, I forget when it was. I've got it here in my notes, but he was excommunicated early on, not because he taught against the Torah, but because he did not believe that Yeshua had an actual body, but Yeshua's body was a phantom. He taught that the God of the Old Testament was an evil, mean, vicious, judgmental God, and the laws of that God were bad. And that he was legalistic, and it was impossible to live up to those laws. And that the God of the New Testament, which is Jesus, was a God of love, mercy, and grace. And this is where we get the idea of law versus grace. That the Old Testament promotes law, and the New Testament promotes grace. So I'm going to kind of stop there, because even though Marcion was branded as a heretic, he was very wealthy, and his teachings influenced the entire Roman Empire. We'll talk about that next time. And he was kicked out of the church, but he still had influence, and his teachings worked their way into and became, and Marvin Wilson admits this in his book, Our Father Abraham, and I will talk about that next time, but admits that the remnants of Marcion exist. Replacement theology and all of these things exist in the modern church. So, the leaven of the Pharisees was not just confined to the Pharisees, but it continued on in the false doctrines and the false teachings of the early church fathers. And that leaven continues in the Christian church down to our day. So when we are celebrating the Feast of Unleavened Bread, it is very important to let go of the leaven of the Pharisees, the leaven of the early church fathers, the leaven of the traditions of all, whether it's the Jews or the Christians, that have made of none effect the word of Elohim. That is part of coming out of Babylon, my people. Come out of her, my people. And we're not better than anybody else. We're not putting anybody down. I'm just dealing, well, maybe I'm putting some of these false teachers down. They need to be put down because their writings, which I have their direct quotes here, and I have not taken them out of context. I have not cherry-picked. I've read the whole chapters where they write these things. I'm not just reading one verse. I'm reading their whole chapters to make sure I'm quoting them correctly. Okay? I'm not doing like what they did. They take something, one verse out of the Bible, and ignore everything around it and cherry pick and make a proof text out of it. I'm not doing that. I'm trying to be an honest, objective, truth-seeking Bible teacher. And that's what we must do if we're going to be honest. But this is not what they are doing. And this is not what your church, your teachers in the pulpit have done in regard to these issues, if they are repeating these things, these lies. So, anyway, we will get more into that next time. But this is the leaven we need to come out of. It's time to start feeding from the tree of life and let go of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, where the snake in the tree is hiding and inserting his destructive, damnable heresies, his lies, his doctrines, his leaven that is permeated throughout all of Christianity down to our time. And I say this with all love to my fellow Christians who are my brothers and sisters, who I love. And I know that many will be in the kingdom of Elohim. And, but Yah is calling us. He's preparing his bride. Not everybody is going to be the bride, but he's preparing his bride. He's calling people out of that right now. And we are one of many voices that are calling people. And Yah is merciful. He loves his people, and he wants his people to come out of these things. And he wants his leaders to start teaching the whole truth and not just parts and pieces of it. Amen. Okay, I'm almost up to an hour. I'm going to quit right there. We'll see you next time. Shalom.